Having accurate figures for your monthly, quarterly, and year-end reports is very important, especially for filing W-2s. But what do you do if you discover that the employee's taxable and subject-to amounts are wrong? Well, we're going to show you how to use an error correction tool to fix this. By the end of the lesson, you should be able to identify common causes of why the amounts of taxable and subject-to earnings are over or understated, and you'll be able to use the Recalculate Subject-to tool to correct these numbers. Sage provides many reports to help you reconcile your payroll totals to prepare for filing taxes. Year-to-date and prior year employer and employee subject-to reports are already on your menu by default. But did you know that there's also an employer and employee subject-to report that uses date ranges, and it comes with your software? When reconciling totals for each withholding, have you ever found that the taxable and subject-to amounts are too high or not high enough? What in the world could ever cause this? Well, you'll be surprised because there are many reasons why this happens. For example, a pay or a deduction was set up incorrectly before you started to process payroll. The pay could have been set up with the wrong tax exemptions, or the deduction was not marked as a pre-tax item when actually it should be subtracted from gross earnings before tax. Another common reason is that a tax rate or limit didn't get updated before you processed the check. Remember, you are responsible for updating the limits and rates for state unemployment and disability insurance and most local taxes. So if this didn't get done before processing the check, the taxable and subject-to amounts will be wrong. Your workflow can also cause a problem. If you process payroll and post the checks out of chronological sequence, this can affect the taxable and subject-to amounts across months or quarters, and it's almost inevitable that you find yourself having to void and reissue a check from the prior year when you've already advanced to a new year and updated taxes. Unfortunately, when you process a prior year check, calculations are still based on year-to-date amounts, which means that the calculations will be wrong because of limits not being met for the current period that had already maxed out when the check was originally issued. Therefore, another reason why the taxable and subject-to amounts are wrong. If you absolutely have to void and reissue a check from a prior year, use the Sage knowledge base for important considerations and to find out what your options are. So then, what's your solution when you do find that the taxable and subject-to amounts are wrong? First, narrow down what caused the issue. Do you have pays or deductions that were set up incorrectly, or did you forget to update the limit for a tax? Correct the issue. Then you can correct the taxable and subject-to totals for each employee record by using the tool called Recalculate Subject-to. This tool takes each posted check in the payroll transaction file and recalculates the taxable and subject-to totals for each withholding in the payroll master file. This can be done for this year or last year's totals. But bear in mind, it only recalculates the taxable and subject-to totals, not the actual tax amounts. If you have to adjust the tax amounts, you will need to do that separately. This lesson only focuses on using the Recalculate Subject-to tool to adjust the taxable and subject-to amounts. If you find that a pay, deduction, or tax was set up incorrectly, you can fix it. Let's go over how to make those corrections. For our example, let's say that the subject-to amounts are overstated, and we've isolated the problem to a pre-tax deduction that was set up incorrectly. This deduction should be subtracted from the gross pay before certain taxes are calculated, meaning it's not taxable or subject to specific withholdings. But someone neglected to indicate which withholdings this deduction is not subject to. So let's fix that problem now. We'll check the boxes for the withholdings that this deduction is exempt from. Remember to always check IRS guidelines or with your tax accountant on the types of withholdings that any pay or deduction is exempt from. Then we'll save and close this deduction record. Payroll needs to evaluate all the posted checks within the given year to recalculate the taxable and subject-to totals. This means that you need to know in which transaction file these checks are stored. Do you retain all the posted checks for the year in the current PRT, or do you use named files? If so, find out which named files contain the earnings information. It's also helpful to narrow down which employees are affected, so you don't need to recalculate the totals for all of the employees in your database. In our example, only certain employees may have the 401k deduction. Once you have this information, you can use the tool to recalculate the taxable and subject-to amounts. And remember to back up your payroll files and ask users to exit the payroll application. This is an intense operation that involves both your payroll transaction and master files. Go to Tools, Recalculate Subject-to. Again, this tool allows you to recalculate this year's or last year's taxable and subject-to totals. If you need to recalculate last year's amounts and you've already updated the tax tables for the current year, you must restore the taxes from the prior year. This checkbox is just a reminder. It does not restore last year's taxes for you automatically. Now, it's really important that you restore last year's taxes when you need to recalculate last year's subject-to and taxable amounts, because payroll needs to know what the limits are for those taxes. And if you're not sure how to do this, go to the Sage Knowledge Base for step-by-step instructions. And we'll talk about this Clear Taxable and Subject-to Period Totals checkbox in a moment. This is a very important checkbox. Since we haven't closed the year yet in the sample database, we're going to recalculate the current year's taxable and subject-to amounts. Now, what about this checkbox? When you check the box, Clear Taxable and Subject-to Period Totals, it literally resets those values to 0 in the employee tax table first, reviews each check in the transaction file to reevaluate the taxable and subject-to amounts, recalculates these amounts check by check based on the current payroll settings, and then writes the newly calculated values in both the employee tax and the check records. If the earnings information is stored in one transaction file, you should check this box, Clear Taxable and Subject-to Period Totals, because if you don't, the new corrected values will be added to the old wrong values, and the taxable and subject-to totals will be even more wrong, perhaps even doubled. If your earnings information is stored in several transaction files, check the box only for the first file that you process. And this should be the file that has the oldest checks because, remember, you need to process the files storing the checks in chronological order. For subsequent transaction files you process, do not check this box, so payroll can correctly accumulate the taxable and subject-to totals. If not all of the employees are affected, then use ranges to select only those employees whose totals are wrong. This will reduce the amount of processing time. When you are ready to begin the recalculation, click Start. Payroll will print a journal when the processing is done. The journal will tell you if there were any errors and what date range of checks were used to recalculate the taxable and subject-to amounts. Make sure you use Recalculate Subject-to until the amounts are updated for the entire year, or if you're doing this mid-year, until the last posted check in that transaction file. Then it's a good idea to run the Subject-to reports again to check the amounts for accuracy. And remember, if you had to use the prior year's tax tables to recalculate amounts for the prior year, make sure to restore the current year's tax tables. In this lesson, we explained why the taxable and subject-to amounts might be wrong. During reconciliation, if you do find that the taxable and subject-to totals are over or understated, now you should be able to pinpoint the cause of the problem and correct it. Then, use the Recalculate Subject-to tool in Payroll to correct the taxable and subject-to amounts.